How I turned a bad day into a great one, my journey. How I turned a bad day into a great one. My journey started with a morning that couldn't have gone worse if I'd tried. It was as though every little thing conspired to ruin my day before it even began. My alarm didn't go off, my coffee maker broke, and as I rushed out the door with an empty stomach and frayed nerves, I stepped directly into a puddle that soaked my only pair of decent shoes. I considered just calling in sick right then, but something inside me insisted that maybe I could still salvage it, so I trudged on, convincing myself that things would get better. On the subway, however, things only got worse. A guy with no sense of personal space bumped into me and spilled his coffee all over my clothes. I barely managed to stifle my frustration, plastering on a forced smile, and tried to clean myself up with a crumpled tissue I found in my pocket. My boss had already been on my case about my negative energy, so I told myself to hold it together and keep going, convinced that my luck had to change at some point. But as I arrived at work, I realized I'd forgotten an important presentation file, left sitting on my desk at home. I felt the dread sink in, knowing my boss would use this as yet another reason to reprimand me, and I braced myself for what was sure to be a disastrous day. In a moment of desperation, I decided to take a quick walk to clear my head, hoping that maybe a change of scenery would help. As I walked down a quiet alleyway, something caught my eye, a small, faded sign that I'd never noticed before, pointing toward a door with the words Fortunes and Fresh Starts painted in peeling letters above it. Normally, I'd never even think about going into a place like that, but something about the day had worn down my usual skepticism, and I felt this strange pull, an urge to just walk in and see if maybe, just maybe, there was something there that could help me turn things around. Inside, the shop was dimly lit and filled with the scent of old books and incense, the walls lined with shelves of odd trinkets, crystals, and dusty bottles. A woman with piercing green eyes sat behind the counter, looking up at me with a knowing smile as though she'd been expecting me. "Bad day?" she asked, her voice soft yet oddly compelling, and I found myself nodding before I could stop myself. She motioned for me to sit, and before I knew it, she was spreading out a set of tarot cards, her eyes narrowing as she studied them intently. "You've got a lot of negative energy surrounding you," she murmured, flipping over one card after another, and the more she spoke, the more I felt this strange tingling sensation, like something deep inside me was shifting. When she finished, she looked at me with a seriousness that sent chills down my spine. "Today, you have the chance to turn everything around, but it won't be easy," she said, handing me a small glass vial filled with a murky liquid. "Drink this at the end of the day, and everything you need to know will be revealed." I almost laughed, ready to brush her off as some kind of scam artist, but something in her eyes kept me from walking away. I took the vial, thanking her awkwardly, and headed back to work, trying to shake off the bizarre encounter. The rest of the day was just as terrible as I'd expected. My boss scolded me in front of everyone for the missing file, my coworkers avoided me, and by lunchtime, I was ready to break down. But every time I thought about leaving, I felt the weight of that vial in my pocket, a strange reminder that I had one last option, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. As the day finally ended, I found myself alone in the office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I sat at my desk, staring at the vial. I felt stupid, part of me convinced it was nothing but colored water, yet another part of me felt that tingling again, stronger than ever. Without letting myself think too much, I uncorked it and took a sip, expecting some terrible taste, but to my surprise, it was almost sweet, like honey with a hint of something herbal. Almost instantly, I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, a strange sensation that was both comforting and exhilarating. And then, as I sat there, I began to notice something odd. Everything around me seemed sharper, more vivid, as though a veil had been lifted. My senses felt heightened, my thoughts clearer, and I realized with a shock that the weight of the day's frustrations had melted away, leaving me feeling lighter than I had in years. That's when I noticed the whispers, faint but unmistakable, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of earshot. I stood up, looking around, but the office was empty. The whispers grew louder, their tones soothing and encouraging, and as I listened, I felt a surge of confidence, a conviction that I could handle anything. I made my way out of the office, the world seeming to shift around me, the lights flickering as I walked down the hallway. By the time I reached the street, everything looked different, almost surreal, as though I were seeing it all for the first time. People passed by with friendly smiles, nodding at me as though they knew me, and I felt an odd kinship with everyone I saw. The whispers guided me, their words filling me with a sense of purpose, and I found myself walking to places I'd never been, meeting people who felt like old friends. Each encounter left me feeling more alive, more connected, and I realized that the darkness of the morning had been completely replaced by this strange, exhilarating light. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew more insistent, urging me to take risks, to push boundaries, to explore places I'd never considered before. I found myself in unfamiliar neighborhoods, alleys that seemed to twist and shift around me, the buildings looming higher than they should. The more I walked, the more I felt myself changing, shedding layers of fear and doubt, until I no longer recognized the person I'd been that morning. By the time I returned home, I was a different person, filled with a power I couldn't fully understand, and as I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the face staring back at me. It was me, and yet something more, something that had been unlocked by the woman's potion, by the whispers that still lingered in my mind. I thought about returning to her shop, asking her what she'd done, but deep down, I knew the answer. I'd been given a gift, a chance to turn my life around, and all it had taken was one bad day, one leap of faith, and a mysterious vial. As I lay down to sleep, the whispers faded, leaving me in a silence that was both peaceful and charged with possibility. And though I knew I'd never be the same, I welcomed the change, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. I used to think I understood the depths of despair, but I was wrong until that fateful night when I truly grasped the weight of a friend's struggle. It started with a simple phone call from Jenna, my childhood friend. We grew up together in a sleepy little town where wild dreams spread like wildfire through the dense woods. But somewhere along the way, life had extinguished those flames for Jenna. She called me that night, her voice trembling, barely a whisper as she confessed that she didn't want to go on anymore. It wasn't the first time we had talked about her feelings of worthlessness. I had tried to help before, but somehow, this time it felt different. An overwhelming wave of concern crashed over me, and my heart raced while I tried to find the right words to pull her back from the edge. I messaged her 100 times, telling her I'd be there in 10 minutes. I raced through the darkened streets under the flickering streetlights that illuminated the way like ghosts guiding me home. When I arrived at her house, it felt as if the air itself had thickened with despair. I knocked frantically on her door, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard her footsteps shuffle toward me. In a moment straight out of a nightmare, when the door creaked open, Jenna's face betrayed a haunting emptiness. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her into my arms and promise her everything would be okay, but something stopped me. I saw it in her eyes, the unrelenting weight of her despair, almost palpable in the space between us. I held my breath and stepped into her dimly lit living room, where shadows danced along the walls like specters of her past. We sat on her worn-out couch, where tears streamed down her cheeks, carving paths through her pain, and that's when I noticed the notebook on the coffee table. It looked innocuous, but upon closer inspection, it was filled with words that bled agony. Scribbled lines of self-hate and despair poured from the pages. I felt familiar anger bubbling inside me. Who had made her feel this way? Who or what could have convinced her that she wasn't enough? Unwilling to skim the surface, I probed deeper, asking her to tell me precisely what she felt, what had led her to believe she was worthless. As she spoke, a darkness filled the room. She talked about her job, how unfulfilling it was, and how her friends had drifted away. She spilled out stories of failures, missed opportunities, and a suffocating loneliness that crushed her spirit. Each confession was like a dagger piercing my heart, yet each one seemed to unlock something darker in the corners of her mind. A memory flickered in my mind, something she said during happier times about a necklace she once had, one that her grandmother had given her. Seeing it again ignited a spark of determination within me, and without thinking, I suggested a crazy idea. I jumped up and told her we needed to reclaim that part of her life. We could find a way to unearth her worth in the same way we used to pretend we were adventurers searching for treasure in the woods. I offered her a challenge. We'd spend the night retracing the paths we used to roam as kids, digging for something, anything, that reminded her just how beautiful life could be. For a moment, the flicker of a smile danced within her eyes, and then it was quickly extinguished by the weight of her doubt. She hesitated, practically fighting back the energy that might have been a yes, but eventually relented, taking my hand with a shaky breath. We slipped into the night, armed with nothing but flashlights and a shared sense of purpose. Climbing over the old wooden fence that separated our childhood neighborhood from the woods felt like crossing a threshold into a world we thought we had lost. Shadows whispered around us as we ventured deeper, brushing against branches that bent beneath the weight of the dark. We switched on our flashlights, illuminating familiar paths cloaked in dim light, where we once laughed, played, and dreamed day after day. With every step, I pointed out small memories, the tree where we'd carved our initials, the spot where we had buried our treasure, a shoebox filled with trinkets, letters, and youthful hopes. Each new discovery brought a faint smile to Jenna's face, and I could almost hear the chains of despair loosening, the shadows retreating. However, that darkness had its claws deep in her heart, and no amount of nostalgia seemed enough to clean the wounds. I started to recite bits from our past that I thought would lighten the mood, our summer camp misfit stories, the time we built a fort in the woods and thought it was an impenetrable fortress. Her laughter began to emerge from behind the darkness, that lovely sound that once lit up my world. It was different, fragile but there, and it gave me hope. So, I pressed on, searching for a spark that could ignite her own self-worth, and suddenly, with a loud crack, a branch snapped beneath my feet, and I stumbled into an old clearing we had long forgotten. My flashlight flickered on something shiny half buried under the leaves. My heart raced, perhaps it was a clue to something greater, a symbol of her worth. I knelt down, swept away the debris, and unearthed something that made my breath catch in my throat, a delicate pendant that looked much like the one Jenna had once described. My heart dropped, it was beautiful. I held it up to the moonlight, hoping it would shine as brightly as the spark I felt inside. "Jenna! Look what I found!" I called out, excitement leaking from every pore. She rushed over, eyes wide, her breath taken away. It was more than the necklace, it was a piece of her forgotten self, a confirmation that beauty and worth could spring from the soil of despair. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached out to clasp it, disbelief sizzling in her voice. The moment when her fingers brushed against the cold metal was electric. My heart swelled as I watched her eyes dance with the recognition of something she thought was lost forever. The darkness receded, and with every breath she took, it felt as if she was pulling life back into her spirit. It was a turning point. As the night wore on, we talked for hours about her hopes and dreams, the things she wanted from life beyond the shadows that consumed her. I saw a glimpse of the Jenna I had known, the girl who once believed in limitless possibilities. We laughed until our sides ached, and there it was, her worth, blossoming like the first flowers of spring emerging from the cold earth. As dawn approached, we found ourselves at the riverbank, the cool air revitalizing our spirits, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I turned to her and said, "You are so much more than the darkness that tries to pull you down. You have a light inside you that the world desperately needs." And I meant it, the person staring back at me had so much potential, so much to give, she just needed someone to help guide her back to it. That night, I helped my friend see her worth once more. It wasn't an instantaneous fix, there were still scars and shadows, but she had taken the first and most crucial step towards reclaiming herself. As we walked back home, hand in hand, the weight of despair had transformed into the promise of hope, and I knew that ultimately, the battle was hers. But sometimes, all it takes to awaken someone's buried worth is a reminder of the light that still flickers within them, even during the darkest nights. I turned down a promotion and regretted it, here's why. Here's why. It was a decision I thought I'd never make. I'd worked hard for years, climbing the ladder at the company, sacrificing weekends, late nights, even parts of my personal life just to get ahead. So when my boss finally offered me that long-awaited promotion, the one I'd been dreaming of, I shocked even myself by saying, no. It wasn't impulsive, or at least it didn't feel that way. It was months of grueling work, the stress, and this voice in my head warning me that taking on more might actually lead me further from the life I wanted. And honestly, at that moment, I'd convinced myself that my refusal was about setting boundaries, about having more time to focus on my relationship with Mia, my fiancée, and avoiding that relentless corporate grind I'd seen ruin so many lives around me. But when I told my boss, his face flashed from surprise to something I couldn't quite place, maybe disappointment or maybe something darker. Either way, he said he respected my choice and that the opportunity might still be there later, though he didn't sound convinced. The strange part was, I walked out of that meeting with a weird, unsettled feeling, like I'd made a decision that was going to echo far beyond just that room. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing changes, subtle at first. Meetings I used to be invited to suddenly didn't have my name on the list. Projects I'd spearheaded got shifted to other people without explanation. My boss became distant, almost cold. It wasn't anything overt, nothing you could put a finger on, but there was this sense of being slowly phased out. People I thought were allies, even friends in the office, began treating me differently, as if I was no longer part of the core team. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but then the passive-aggressive comments started, little digs about how some people aren't committed enough or might not be up for the challenge. It didn't take long to realize these were directed at me. One day, I ran into Mia after work, and when she asked how things were going, I made the mistake of telling her how much I regretted not taking the promotion. She gave me that sympathetic look but added something I didn't expect, that she was honestly relieved I hadn't accepted it. She said she missed me, missed us, and that this way, we'd have more time together, time to plan our future. I wanted to feel reassured by her words, but instead, I just felt like I was trapped between two walls that were slowly closing in, with the pressure from work on one side and Mia's expectations on the other. Then came the company-wide announcement of the new promotion candidate, Mark. I couldn't stand him, but he was technically competent, the kind of guy who did just enough to avoid trouble and somehow always ended up looking good to management. He'd only been with the company for 2 years, compared to my 5. But somehow he'd slid right into the position. The worst part was, he wasn't shy about rubbing it in, always dropping hints about his bright future and the vision he had for our team. I wanted to punch him, but I didn't. I just kept my head down, hoping to get through the awkwardness and move on. But with each passing day, the resentment ate at me, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. And I began questioning everything, from my decision to Mia's support to whether I even wanted to be at this company anymore. One evening, after Mark had once again undermined me in front of the team, I got home, looked at myself in the mirror, and realized something: I was losing myself. The person staring back at me looked defeated, not like the ambitious, determined guy I used to be. And it was terrifying because I couldn't tell if that was from my own choice or if the environment around me was doing this to me. Things hit a breaking point at the next quarterly review. My performance scores, which had always been top tier, were suddenly below average. My boss, who usually praised my work, barely looked me in the eye as he went through my review, pointing out every minor flaw and emphasizing that I'd lost my edge. By then, it was clear. My career here was effectively over unless I did something drastic. I tried reaching out to HR, explaining the situation, the subtle retaliation, the snide comments, but they told me there was little they could do without hard evidence. Maybe you should consider a fresh start, they suggested, which was HR code for "we don't care." I remember leaving that meeting feeling like I was in free fall. Mia was supportive, but even she couldn't understand the full extent of it, the frustration, the shame. It felt like my life was unraveling. My job, my stability, my sense of self, it was all slipping through my fingers because of one decision. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found out Mia had been planning a wedding date behind my back, even choosing a venue. She'd decided that since I was no longer on the promotion track, I'd have more time for us. She meant well, but it felt like a slap in the face. She didn't understand that my career wasn't just a job, it was a part of who I was, a part she was casually asking me to abandon for her vision of our future. That night, we had a massive fight. I told her everything, from the retaliation at work to how I felt like a stranger in my own life. She cried, saying she didn't know things were that bad, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let her, my job, and myself down. I'd let everyone control my life, and now I was stuck in a purgatory of my own making. Desperate to regain some control, I went to my boss and told him I was ready to step up, that I wanted another chance at the promotion. He looked at me with this smug smile, like he'd known I'd come crawling back. He told me they'd already moved on, that the company was looking for people fully committed to their role. In that moment, I realized he'd never intended to give me a second chance. I was just another pawn to him, a stepping stone for Mark, a warning to others about what happens when you don't fall in line. Feeling humiliated, I walked out of his office, and for the first time in my career, I didn't feel any loyalty to the company I'd sacrificed so much for. I realized I'd been clinging to an illusion, to a sense of loyalty that was never reciprocated. A week later, I handed in my resignation. The company barely reacted, and that hurt almost as much as everything else. I left without a plan, without even knowing what I wanted, just with the overwhelming need to escape. At first, I thought leaving would make me feel liberated, but instead, it felt like free falling. Job offers weren't rolling in like I'd expected. Mia and I drifted further apart, and the guilt of everything weighed on me. It was only after months of soul-searching that I found a small startup willing to take a chance on me. It wasn't glamorous, the pay was modest, and the hours were long, but for the first time in years, I felt a spark again. I had the freedom to make decisions, to learn from my mistakes, and rebuild myself on my own terms. Looking back, turning down that promotion had been the beginning of a painful journey that shattered my illusions but ultimately gave me the clarity I needed. I lost a lot: friends, stability, even my relationship with Mia, but I gained something far more valuable: the strength to start over and the wisdom to never let myself be boxed in again. If I could give advice to anyone reading this, it'd be this: sometimes, what feels like a wrong decision is just life pushing you toward the right path, no matter how painful the journey may be. I never thought I would find myself stuck in a rut, but here I am, typing this in the quiet of my dimly lit room at 3 a.m., and all I can think about is the moment I realized that everything I had was, well, too comfortable. It started innocently enough: mornings melted into afternoons, which blended effortlessly into evenings. I had a steady job at a local library, my friends were all within a stone's throw, and I had developed a routine that felt as cozy as my favorite placemat. But buried under my blissful ignorance was this niggling sensation that something was missing, a voice that whispered to me that life was slipping through my fingers, and each moment was just a little too familiar, a little too safe. The change was subtle at first. I noticed it one rainy Tuesday when I decided to take my usual route home, and I bumped into an old classmate of mine, Aaron. He had always been the adventurous type, the one who would organize camping trips and spontaneous road trips with friends. I remember looking at him, all windswept hair and a spark in his eyes, and thinking how alive he looked, while I felt like a faded photograph. We exchanged pleasantries, and he invited me to join him on a hiking trip that weekend, something I usually would have laughed off, preferring the familiarity of my couch and Netflix. But something inside me cracked, and I agreed before I even had a chance to think about it. Fast forward to Saturday, and as I strapped on my boots, I felt a swirl of anxiety in my stomach. I had never really hiked before, not beyond the local trails at least, and I was about to plunge into the unknown with a group of strangers. That was the first sign I was pushing myself, and despite my nerves, I also felt a rush of excitement. The hike was exhausting, the air crisp, and every step unleashed a feeling I hadn't felt in years: freedom. We trekked through towering trees that whispered ancient secrets, climbed over rocks, and balanced on narrow trails slicing through cliffs that plunged into vast valleys below. I even found myself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, that I stood at the peak of a mountain overlooking a breathtaking view. A thought struck me hard: that this was the kind of moment I had been craving, the kind of disruption to my monotonous life that I desperately needed. It was there, amidst the camaraderie of my fellow hikers and the awe of nature, that I made a promise to myself. No more stale evenings spent lifeless in front of the screen, no more night after night of bland comfort. I would embrace change, step outside this box I had built around myself, and be bold again. On the way back down, the air felt electric with possibilities. Aaron and the others offered more trips: whitewater rafting, rock climbing, a road trip across the country. I signed up for them all, feeling liberated as I said yes to things that scared me. But remember how I said change can be unsettling? Well, as thrilling as the next few months became, I couldn't shake off this persistent itch, as if my transformation had awoken something in me that was now restless. At first, I felt like an adventurer in my own life, but then as the weeks passed, with new opportunities coming at me like an avalanche, I found the boundaries of my comfort zone shifting ever so slightly. I craved more excitement. Dreams of travel to distant places lingered in my thoughts, kindling a blossoming wanderlust, but each trip brought with it an overwhelming wave of fear and doubt. What if I failed? What if these new friends evaporated, leaving me to face solitude again?